So in this video, I want to go over all the reasons why I picked up the Sony NX800 and how I see it being beneficial to my business, particularly for the projects that I work on and the workflow that I use for a lot of these projects. I'll also go over why I went with the NX800 over the Z200, and I'll also provide some clips for you to download so you can take a look at the footage and see if the camera might be a good fit for you as well. A link to download those videos is in the description. All right, so back in late August, I think it was, I was sitting on my back porch one evening just relaxing, and I had this random thought that came to me, which was like, why aren't camcorders more popular? So I pulled out my phone, I went to Sony's website, because if I was gonna get a camcorder, I kind of wanted to stay in the ecosystem. And I checked out their selection of camcorders, and most of them seemed to be, they weren't new. Like nothing had really come out, I feel like, in the past few years. And I know this because about 9 years ago, my dad asked me for a recommendation for a camcorder to record my younger brother's basketball games on. And again, this was 9 years ago, and the camcorders were still like very similar. At least the prosumer ones were. And then yeah, so I had this thought sitting on my porch. It was kind of random. And then a day or two after that, the YouTube channel CBP put out this video, and I watched it and I was like, now I really want a camcorder. And then I think David Moorfield came out with a video talking about the Z200 and if it could replace his FX6. Now I wasn't looking to replace my FX6. I was rather looking for something that could, complement that camera. I already had an FX30, but I thought, a camcorder, just the convenience of it. I feel like there's scenarios where that would come in really handy and I would use it. That camcorder, the Z200 and NX800, it seemed to fit everything that I was looking for in a camcorder, except the price. So the Z200 is priced at around $4,000, while the NX800, it costs like $3,300. So the difference between the two cameras is the Z200 has SDI out ports, time code in and out ports, and through a firmware update that's coming out later this year, the ability to record to the .mxf file format. And so the NX800 doesn't have any of those functionality, but other than that, the cameras are pretty identical. So as you can see, I bought an NX800, and why did I choose the NX800 over the Z200? Well, it was kind of a tough decision for me, and essentially what it came down to was I asked myself, do I need the SDI and the time code? And if I do, is it worth the extra $700 for me? My initial thoughts to the cameras in general was that they were a little out of my price range. I wish both options were just slightly cheaper, considering their limitations with having only a 1-inch sensor. So I was trying to keep my costs as low as possible when I was considering picking up this camera. And I felt that since my FX6 has both of those options, that if I really needed those capabilities, the SDI and the time code, I kind of already had them with the FX6. I also have an FX30, and that camera doesn't have either of those ports on it, and I've gotten by, just fine without them so far. And if I really needed time code on the NX800, I could do it through the audio port, which I've done before on the FX30 when I've used the Tentacle sync system. We just went through the audio port and it worked out fine. I'd only really be missing out on the SDI port, and was that worth an extra $700 to me, or was I fine saving $700 not having that feature? And the answer was yes, I was fine without it. If I really needed SDI, like really needed it, I have an FX6 for that. And this kind of leads me to my next point, which is this camcorder is an extremely convenient B cam or even a C cam. I was looking to purchase a B cam I wasn't looking to replace my FX6, but rather have something in my kit that would come in handy in various situations. This would be a great B cam for something like a multicam dock setup. You know, you'd have maybe your FX6 or your FX9 as your main cam, and then you can hand this camera off to a second shooter that can capture a wide range of scenarios without the need of having to stop and swap lenses. Like, I'm envisioning like you're filming in a car, maybe a car scene where the 24mm would come in handy, it would work great. And then you quickly had to step outside of the vehicle, and then you immediately need that 480mm zoom range. I'm thinking something like a hunting documentary, or, you know, something like that. Maybe that's my Montana coming out. But I just envision like a scenario like that where this camera would be so handy to have. And after listing out all the reasons why I thought this camera would be great for my business, it made a lot of sense for me to pick one up. And since this is somewhat of a big purchase and one I debated over, the thing that really tipped the scale for me was knowing it would help offset my tax bill somewhat. You know, I asked myself, would I rather pay, in this case, $3,300 to the government, you know, through taxes? Or could I help offset that tax bill a little bit and put that money back into my business? And I think the answer is obvious. And once I put it like that, I was like, you know what, I'm gonna buy the camera. So one of the biggest factors for why I wanted this camcorder was for its zoom range. It's the full frame equivalent of a 24 to 480mm zoom range. And then if you add in the clear image zoom, that puts its zoom range at 720mm. Again, and that would be in 4K, which is just great. I'm sure we've all been in situations, particularly outdoors, where we wish we had some extra zoom range. Now, I have the Sony Z200 lens, the f4 version, and I've tried a lot of different things to get just a little bit more range out of that. I've used clear image zoom, which gets me to about 300mm when it's zoomed all the way in. I've also put it on my FX30, which also gets me to 300mm, and then if I use clear image zoom on that, it could get me to like 450, I think, if my math is correct. And I flirted with the idea of picking up like maybe a used 200 to 600mm lens, which would run me about $1,700. But that would probably only limit me to using it in outdoor scenarios, since the variable aperture on that goes from 5.6 to 6.3. But for me, the number one real world use case scenario in which this camera will come in handy is when I'm out filming at the buffalo ranch that we have here on my reservation. It's when I'm out there filming that I always wish I had some extra zoom range. You know, I try and get as close as I can to the buffalo without putting myself in danger. And so this extra zoom range, you know, in this camcorder, you know, it helps me do just that. It helps me, you know, I get close enough, but I have that extra zoom range where I don't feel like I have to get too close to them, and I can still get some close-up shots of the buffalo. Now, when I bought this camera back in October, I purchased it at that particular time because I thought I was going to be working on a project where I was going to need that zoom range because I was going to be out at the buffalo ranch. I think I mentioned it in a previous video that project ended up falling through for me. Now, actually, I had two projects that were going to take me out there, but both projects didn't happen. So I've still yet to take this camera out to shoot the buffalo, but I know eventually I'll be out there, and I'm really looking forward to that. The next scenario I envision myself bringing this camera along is when I'm doing something like conference or event videos, particularly ones that involve like maybe a stage or presenters or, you know, speakers. I've worked enough events to know that this camera will be useful to, you know, set up maybe in the back of the room and use it to capture, full presentations. And then I can have that camera running, and then I can run around with my FX6 or my FX30 and get some other angles of the stage or the speakers or presenters, and as well as I can get some reaction shots of the audience as well. Now, I don't do weddings, but this would be a great camera, I think, for those as well. It would be perfect for like this. You could use this to record the ceremony, as well as like the speeches at the reception, and then use your other cameras to get a little more higher quality footage or B-roll, things like that. And with the new AI processing chip that's in these cameras, apparently that's a big selling point, is the AI auto tracking and auto framing. This would be extremely useful, again, for conferences and events, or like I said, even weddings. I haven't tested this feature out yet, but once I do, I'll be sure to report back on it. Next, this is a great tool to have in your kit if you do any type of live streaming, again, like with conferences or events. Now, I do live streaming on occasion, but it's mostly for smaller events. I wouldn't quite say I do it professionally, meaning my business isn't structured to handle higher end live streams that require like, multicam or multi-file functionality. Rather, I'll do the occasional live streaming event that, if they're really just looking they need great audio and quality visuals. Again, this is a great camera to set up in the back of the room to live stream an event. The AI tracking features would also come in handy in this type of setting. The only limitation I see would be if you're indoors and the lighting isn't that great, how well the 1-inch sensor would hold up, especially if you had to zoom in to where the aperture goes to like f4.5. If the lighting is great, then no worries. And this camera has the variable aperture. It's 2.8 on the wide end and 4.5 on when it's fully zoomed in. And based off of my own experiences with the camcorder, for live streaming, I would set the color profile to S-Cinetone as opposed to like the more common S-Log3. I found S-Log3 in this camera can kind of be a little bit noisy, but for live streaming where there maybe isn't any post-production work that's involved, S-Cinetone I would say would be the way to go. And then lastly, another reason why I picked up the NX800 is it allows me to have a third camera on set if needed. Now there could be a situation where I might need a third camera for like an interview setup. I haven't had one yet where it's been requested or even needed, but one day that might happen, and it'll be nice to have an extra camera on set. But more realistically, I could see myself using a 3-camera setup for something like a video podcast, or anything where there might be more than one person in the frame. A podcast is just something I envision, a wide angle shot, say of the 2 people, and I would use this as my wide shot, and then, with my setup, I'd have a FX6 on one side that's, the tight angle on, speaker 1, have my FX30 going this way, a tight angle on speaker 2, and then again, this would be my wide shot, and that'd be a perfect 3-camera setup. All Sony cameras, they should all be somewhat easy to match in post. So yeah, those are all the reasons I purchased the NX800 and the ways I envision using it and how I see it helping my business. I think it's a great camera to have in my kit. I know a lot of people are curious about the camera itself, and maybe you're hesitant to pick it up because you're not sure if you want to spend, upwards of $4,000 on a camera that has a 1-inch sensor. I get it. That's why I've included a few test clips that you can download and check the footage yourself. These clips were shot a few months ago on a crisp October day here in rural Montana. So I'm still taking this camera through its rounds, so stay tuned to my channel where I'll be taking it along with me on many of the jobs that I have coming up. If you have any questions on maybe something I didn't address here in the video, please feel free to ask in the comments, and I'd be more than willing to answer them for you.